Today, I want to tell you about a woman whose name still moves through the Arizona canyons like restless wind. Her name was Mara Cole. To the canyon folk, she was known as the Ghost of Silver Canyon, a name murmured in trading posts. Passed quietly beside campfires, people said she lived alone, high above the valley, in a cabin she built with her own hands. A lone figure among red stone and broken trails. But Mara Cole had not always been a ghost. Once she had been full of promise. She was the daughter of Samuel Cole, a schoolteacher who raised her on hymns and hardbound books. Her laughter once echoed through the small church halls of the valley town. And she had been engaged. His name was Luke Mercer, a miner. Young, driven, and determined to wrest a future from stubborn rock. Together they dreamed of a life shaped by their own labor. A small house, perhaps children, perhaps a garden where laughter would linger. But in the West, dreams always demand payment. Luke staked a claim deep in the canyon, convinced a rich vein waited below. His hands split and blistered, his back bent beneath the work. Yet his spirit never faltered. Mara believed in him without question. She walked beside him, even when others doubted the land would ever give them anything back. Then came the night of the storm. Luke rode out to settle a dispute with a neighboring claim, an argument over lines drawn in dust and blood. Land, wealth, the things men have always killed for. He never came home. 2 days later they found him, shot from behind, half crushed beneath a boulder, as if someone meant to bury, not just his body, but his story. There were no arrests, no reckoning. The sheriff only shrugged, neighbors whispered, and the land kept its secrets. For Mara, it was more than murder. It was the theft of a life before it could begin. That same winter, Samuel Cole, already weakened by illness, passed away. With Luke gone, Mara was left unanchored. No family, no reason to return east. The town that once felt like home became a silent courtroom where everyone knew the truth, yet no one dared speak it. Mara buried Luke with her own hands. Then she turned her back on the valley for good. She climbed higher into the canyon ridges where the wind scoured stone clean and the world stretched wide, empty, and unforgiving. Land no one else wanted. Too harsh for comfort. Too distant for ease. But to Mara Cole it meant freedom. She bought her claim cheap. She built a cabin from rough-cut logs. Slowly, she shaped a life. Not a joyful one, not a full one, but a life rooted in survival, carved out of silence. The years passed. Mara kept to herself. She planted corn and beans in a narrow strip of stubborn soil. She strung fences by hand, raised chickens, and kept a mule she named Belle. She made soap, boiled herbs, traded them in town every few months for flour, coffee, and salt. She spoke little. Before long, the canyon folks stopped trying to know her. They whispered instead. Some said Silver Canyon had swallowed her joy the same way it had taken her fiancé. Others claimed grief had turned her strange, a woman who forgot how to smile. A few believed she was dangerous, best left alone, and so she became a rumor. Her name tangled with stories of canyon winds that screamed through the night, a woman beyond reach. But behind the whispers, the truth was simpler and far more fragile. Mara Cole lived there, not because she loved the silence, but because it was the only place where her grief could breathe. She filled her days with work, splitting logs, mending wire, hauling water from a frozen creek. Her nights stretched long, broken only by firelight and the distant cries of coyotes. Sometimes she read old books, though she knew the words by heart. Other nights she caught herself speaking aloud to memories, to ghosts. Fragments of the past, pieces of conversations long gone. As seasons turned to silence, wrapped around her like a second skin. But even a second skin can fracture. In the still moments between tasks, Mara felt its weight press against her chest. She told herself she chose solitude. Yet at the edge of her land, she often paused, staring down at the empty road below, wondering if anyone would ever climb it again. She often found herself lingering there, asking the quiet road if anyone would ever climb it again. That winter came early, sharp as shattered glass. Snow fell heavy, sealing the mountain under a white lid while the wind sliced through every seam in the cabin walls. Mara Cole was ready. She always was. Firewood stacked high to the rafters. Smoked venison hung in the cellar. Beans sat sealed in tidy jars. And still, despite the careful preparation, unease worked at her. Something in the air felt wrong. One afternoon, as she replaced a fence post split by frost, her mule Belle snorted sharply and stamped the frozen ground. Mara straightened. Her breath clouded white against the dull sky. Storm clouds pressed low over the ridge. Yet it wasn't the weather that tightened her chest. It was the sound of hooves, distant measured. Her fingers curled around the handle of her hatchet. She turned toward the ridge, every instinct sharpened by years of solitude screaming warning. Then through the veil of snow 2 figures emerged. Tall riders, broad-shouldered, wrapped in deer hide and fur. Their horses swayed with exhaustion, legs trembling beneath them, faces half lost to shadow as daylight faded. Their movements were slow, intentional, Apache. They did not rush, did not threaten. One lifted a hand in greeting. The other swept the horizon with sharp, restless eyes. Mara's first instinct was to retreat to the cabin and take up her rifle, but something held her still. The way they sat there, mounts spent yet unbowed, worn yet unbroken, carrying something older than fear. The canyon fell silent. The life she had built, sealed tight against loss, had just been breached. She told herself it was only a moment, only one night, but deep down, she knew fate never knocked politely. It arrived on tired horses, under a storm-heavy sky, asking for shelter, and once the door opened, nothing was ever the same again. The wind sharpened as Mara Cole reached the last fence post. Snow spun through the canyon air, stinging her face as the sky sagged low above the ridge. She had felt it all morning, the weight. The warning that the storm would break before sundown. But it wasn't only the storm that stole her breath. From the muffled stillness came a sound she hadn't heard in months. Hooves. Not the scattered rush of deer or elk, but the deliberate cadence of riders. Slow, heavy, each step pressing deep into frozen earth. Mara froze where she stood. Belle tossed her head, ears pinned back in unease. 2 shapes crested the ridge, shadowed in dim light. For a moment, Mara thought the snow was lying to her. Fur cloaks snapped in the wind, outlines blurred. But as they drew closer, there was no denying it. 2 men on horseback, tall, broad-framed, faces half hidden, yet proud in their bearing despite exhaustion. Her senses sharpened. For years the valley had spoken of raids, of bloodshed, of cultures colliding. Mara had heard every story and carried her own quiet fear. But standing there on her land, hatchet clenched in her fist, what she saw was not threat, but weariness. The horses staggered, lathered with sweat, shaking from the long ride. Snow clung to their manes like splintered ice. And the men, strong, dangerous by frontier measure. One lifted his hand again, slowly, palm open, a sign of peace. The other, younger, tighter in his movements, scanned the horizon with dark, guarded eyes. Mara's instincts thundered. She wanted to retreat, to bar the door. She told herself that solitude was safer than risk, that stepping back would keep her alive. Yet something anchored her where she stood, something in the way the older man carried himself. Calm, grounded, free of arrogance. When he spoke, his voice was deep, carrying no authority, only a request. We mean no harm. Our horses are spent. A storm is coming. May we shelter here, just for the night. The words lingered in the frozen air, suspended between falling snow and the hollow silence of the canyon. Mara Cole felt her throat tighten. She stood alone, 2 strangers at her gate. Every story she had ever heard told her to refuse. Yet her heart hardened as it was wavered. She swallowed, forcing the word past her lips. Yes, one night. She told herself that was all. Nothing more. She led them toward the barn. Her boots crunched over ice as she pulled the door open wide enough for the horses to stagger inside. The animals nearly collapsed into the straw sides, heaving steam rolling off their backs. Mara took them in, the sharp ribs beneath hide. The look of creatures driven too far by cold and distance. Something in her chest softened. She said nothing, but the older man inclined his head in thanks. Thank you. There was no pride in his voice, only the humility of a man long accustomed to closed doors. He gave his name, Alwyn. His companion, the younger one, sharp-eyed and rigid, spoke reluctantly. Tarek. Mara nodded once in return, offering nothing more. Not yet. That night the wind battered the cabin walls, rattling the shutters like dry bones. Mara stirred a pot of stew she had prepared earlier, thick with root vegetables and wild herbs. She had never intended to share it, but the image of those near-dead horses tugged at her conscience. With a quiet breath, she set out 2 additional bowls. Alwyn and Tarek stepped inside, stamping snow from their boots. The air shifted the moment they crossed the threshold. Mara's cabin, her hard-won refuge, felt smaller somehow, weighted by unfamiliar presence. They paused just inside, uncertain. Sit, she said, pointing toward the table. Her voice was firm, edged with iron. It was not an invitation. It was necessity, warmth, a hot meal, nothing more. They obeyed, and the 3 of them ate in silence. Not an awkward silence, but one shaped by caution. An unspoken agreement that no one would offer more than required. The fire crackled. Shadows rippled across the rough-hewn walls. Outside, the storm fully broke, snow tearing sideways through the canyon wind, howling like wolves in the dark. Mara studied her guests in the shifting firelight. Alwyn was older. Deep lines marked his face, his eyes sharp but not cruel. He carried the quiet certainty of a man who had once led others, perhaps commanded them, yet there was no sense of dominance in him. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, it was with the measured restraint of someone who wasted no words. Tarek, by contrast, was taut as a drawn bow. His hand hovered near his knife. His gaze flicked from Mara's rifle mounted above the hearth to the dark corners of the room. He barely touched his stew, instead, scanning, watching, waiting. His silence was not ease, but suspicion, the kind that saw danger in every shift of shadow. At last, Alwyn broke the quiet. You live here alone. From another man, the question might have felt intrusive. From him, it was simple curiosity softened by tone. Mara hesitated. She nodded once, offering nothing more. Alwyn did not press. He only dipped his head as though her answer needed no defense, as if he understood the weight of choosing solitude over people. Tarek's eyes flickered, unreadable. His silence carried meaning, and Mara Cole could feel his distrust like a blade drawn just short of skin. The night lengthened. Mara gathered extra blankets and placed them near the hearth. The barn might shelter horses well enough, but not men with frozen hands and stiffened limbs. Tarek hesitated. Alwyn accepted the offering with quiet grace. Later, Mara settled into her rocking chair beside the fire, a book resting unopened in her lap. Across the room, Alwyn and Tarek lay on the floor, their breathing slow and steady. Their bodies were still save for the occasional twitch of muscle and the unrest of sleep. Outside, the storm raged on, slamming into the cabin walls, locking the world beneath snow and ice. And inside, Mara felt something stir. Something she had not felt in years. Not fear, disruption. Her world, ordered silent, had shifted. 2 strangers had crossed her threshold. 2 lives burdened by their own storms had collided with hers. She told herself it was only for the night, that by morning the storm would pass and they would be gone. But as she watched the firelight move across Awen's face, she saw it there: loss, weariness, the weight of memory. It mirrored her own. And with a quiet shiver, she understood that some storms were never meant to pass quickly. Some storms settled in the heart, reshaping everything they touched. The stew cooled in its bowls before anyone spoke again. The wind outside howled with such force that even the thick log walls trembled. Mara Cole sat across the table from two strangers, her spoon lifting and falling in silence. Awen ate slowly, deliberately. He rarely looked at her. But when he did, his gaze was steady, respectful, as if he saw her not as a curiosity, but as a presence to be honored. Tarek remained tense, his jaw set, his eyes darting. From the rifle above the hearth to the shuttered window, to Mara herself. The only sounds were the storm clawing at the cabin and the crackle of fire. Mara had lived inside silence for years, but never this kind. This silence breathed. It waited, heavy with words unspoken. When the meal ended, she gathered the bowls without asking. They rose to help, but she shook her head. This was her cabin, her order, her steel. She did not miss the way Awen rose afterward, splitting the last of her stacked firewood with practiced ease. He carried the logs inside without a word, as if work itself were his form of thanks. Tarek followed him out to the barn, his movements sharp, restless. From the doorway, Mara watched as he tested the loose hinge on the barn door. With quick, precise motions, he set it right, hammering a nail back into place, checking every latch, as though danger waited behind each gust of wind. He said nothing, offered no reason. Yet his actions spoke clearly. Vigilance was his calling. Mara returned to the cabin and paused near the fire. Her days had always followed the same rhythm: work, eat, rest, repeat. Now that rhythm had fractured. Two men had entered her solitude, carrying not only their bodies, but the weight of their histories. When Awen stepped back inside, snow clinging thick to his shoulders, she noticed again the steadiness of him. He did not fill the quiet with questions. He did not pry. He did not demand answers. He simply was calm in a way that seemed to steady the very air around him. It unsettled her, and yet it eased something deep in her chest. That night, the storm worsened. Wind screamed against the windows, rattling them like bones in a restless grave. Beyond Mara's land, the trails vanished beneath an endless white blanket. No one was leaving the canyon anytime soon. When Mara Cole stepped back inside, Awen met her eyes for a brief moment. No words passed between them. None were needed. He understood the storm's verdict as clearly as she did. The world had been sealed shut. For as long as the snow held, they were bound together by necessity. Tarek paced near the door, his hand never drifting far from his knife. Mara did not speak to him, nor did he speak to her. His distrust was plain, and she did not take offense. Once she might have bristled beneath such watchfulness. Now she recognized it for what it was: a wound carried from elsewhere, from a life shaped by danger. Mara sat back in her chair, shadows moving across her face as Awen settled opposite her. His broad frame relaxed but never slackened. For a long while they said nothing. Yet within that quiet, something fragile began to take shape. Not friendship, not yet, but a thin thread of respect light as smoke. She caught herself noticing the way he listened, even in silence. How his presence filled the room without pressing against her walls. As if he carried silence differently than she did, not as armor, but as company. Mara lowered her gaze to her hands, rough scarred by years of labor, and wondered how long it had been since she had felt truly seen inside her own home. The storm continued its assault, but inside the cabin, something else stirred. A question she did not voice. Perhaps silence did not always mean loneliness. The night dragged on. Wind shook the shutters. Snow pressed against the cabin as though it meant to swallow the world whole. Inside, the fire cast long shadows. Along the walls, its warmth, the only barrier against the cold beyond. Mara Cole sat with her sewing in her lap, though the thread hung loose between her fingers. Across from her, Alwyn knelt close to the fire, a small piece of bone in his hands and a knife dulled by years of use. He began to carve. Each stroke was careful, patient, as though the act itself were a kind of prayer. Tarek lingered near the door, sharpening an arrowhead, his presence a restless shadow. Yet it was Alwyn's steady rhythm that held Mara's attention. For a long time neither spoke. Then in a low voice, weighted more by memory than sound, Alwyn said, "Our village once stood in the southern canyons. Red stone, clear springs. It's gone now." Mara looked up, her breath catching on the heaviness carried by those simple words. "They came at night," he continued. "Men with rifles. We fought. But fire moved faster than courage. When morning came, there was nothing left but ash. Some fled north. Some surrendered to the reservations. The rest—" He paused. The knife remained steady in his hand. "Drifted." The silence that followed was heavy, but not empty. Mara felt the edges of her own grief stir like embers beneath old ash. For years she had carried her story alone, spoken it to no one, as if silence could protect her heart. But here was a man who knew what it meant to be uprooted, to lose not only people, but an entire world. "My fiancé was killed," she said quietly. The words felt unfamiliar after so long, unspoken. "Luke Mercer. He was shot over a boundary line. They found him 2 days later. No justice, no answers." She stared into the flames, watching them twist and coil. "After that, I buried him myself. And I built this place. I thought if I stayed high enough, far enough, the world wouldn't be able to reach me again." Her voice wavered, but she kept going. She had always told herself that solitude meant strength, that she needed no one, not neighbors, not friends. But the truth cut closer. She had been afraid that if she opened her door again, she would only lose whatever stepped inside. The fire popped, scattering sparks into the dark. Alwyn lifted his gaze. In his eyes, Mara Cole saw no pity, only understanding. "You know silence," he said quietly. "Yes." She breathed the word. He nodded. "So do I." The blade moved again in his hand, paring away another thin curl of bone. Slowly a form took shape, a small rising sun, its edges rough but purposeful. Mara found herself watching not the carving alone, but the steadiness of his hands. The patience of a man who had weathered storms far worse than snow. Their eyes met in the firelight, and for a heartbeat the storm outside seemed to fall away. There was no romance there, no reckless vow, only something older, more delicate, recognition. Two people, both scarred, both shaped by loss, sitting by a fire admitting, without words, that solitude had not been their first choice, only their last defense. Tarek shifted in the corner, his disapproval sharp and unspoken. Mara barely noticed. Her world had narrowed to the fire, the carving, and the quiet weight of what was being shared. The night pressed on the cabin, wrapped in howling wind, but inside there was a different stillness. For the first time in years, Mara felt silence, not as an enemy, but as a space where memory could be spoken without shattering her. As Alwyn set the unfinished pendant in his palm, continuing with patient strokes, Mara realized something she had nearly forgotten, that even after loss, there were voices in the world that echoed her own. Not to erase grief, not to replace what was gone, but to remind her she was not as alone as she believed. The storm began to ease. Yet inside the cabin another storm was gathering. Snow still pressed the windows, but the air had warmed not with comfort, but with something unsettled waiting. Mara Cole felt it before anyone spoke, the looks, the pauses, the silence, no longer empty, but charged. Tarek's presence had shifted in subtle ways. He asked small things about her garden, the mule in the barn, the books on her shelf. He listened not to pry, but to understand. Each time his eyes held hers steady and unafraid, something stirred deep within her. Something she had buried long ago. It frightened her. She had sworn never to feel again, never to let another life draw close enough that losing it would break her. And yet here was this man carrying his own grief, shaping bone by firelight, loosening walls she had built with such care. Tarek saw it too. That evening, after the stew was finished in silence and the fire burned low, he broke the fragile balance. His voice was tight. "Hosh!" The word carried restraint that barely held. "You shouldn't let him stay." Mara looked up, startled by the suddenness. Tarek's dark eyes fixed on her, unblinking. "You're making him forget," he said. The tone was more accusation than warning. "Forget why we keep moving." The words struck deeper than she expected. She wanted to argue, to say she had asked for none of this, that she had offered only shelter, food, a place to rest, but something in Tarek's voice stopped her, because she knew. He was not entirely wrong. Alwyn, seated quietly near the fire, did not deny it. His hands went still, over the small carving resting in his lap. For the first time since their arrival, a shadow crossed his face, not anger, but conflict. Mara Cole's chest tightened. In that moment she understood it clearly. Alwyn had begun to care for her, in ways neither of them had planned. And worse still, she realized she cared as well. The thought frightened her more than the storm outside, more than the bandits she had once driven from her land. Tarek's voice cut through the silence again. "Hope is a weakness," he said flatly. "It gets tribes destroyed. You're making him hope for something he cannot have." Mara forced herself to meet his gaze. When her voice came, it was steady but low. "I didn't invite hope into this cabin. It came on its own." Tarek's jaw tightened. He turned away, sharpening his arrowhead with sharp, angry strokes. Stone scraped against flint, the sound ringing through the room like a warning. The fire cracked between them, its light dancing across Mara's face and Tarek's broad shoulders. The silence that followed was no longer cold. It carried heat, tension, the kind of quiet that pressed against the heart and demanded to be acknowledged. Mara held herself still, her hands folded in her lap, though her pulse raced. She wanted to speak, to ask Alwyn what stirred behind his eyes, to know whether he felt the same pull she did. But she stayed silent. Words would only fan the fire already burning between them. At last, Alwyn lifted his gaze. His eyes met hers across the fire, and in that instant Mara saw it. The truth Tarek had spoken aloud. Alwyn was beginning to hope. The sight both steadied her and unraveled her. She turned back to the flames, letting silence say what words could not. Outside, the storm's howl softened, its fury easing. But inside the cabin, the storm had only just begun. For the first time in years, Mara Cole was no longer a ghost drifting through the canyons. She stood at the edge of something vast, something dangerous. And in the shifting firelight, she understood silence was no longer her shield. It had become the place where longing lived. The storm finally passed, leaving the canyon washed in brittle light and quiet. Snow lay thick across the land, the kind of stillness that made the world feel clean again. Mara rose early, as she always did. She fed Belle, scattering grain for the hens. For a brief moment, life felt almost ordinary, almost safe. But safety in Silver Canyon never lasted. By mid-morning, she felt the unease before she saw it. The animals grew restless. Belle's ears flicked sharply. The hens crowded the coop, refusing to wander. Then came the sound hooves. Distant but unmistakable. Not the slow pace of weary travelers, but the hard thunder of men riding fast. Mara's heart kicked hard in her chest as she stepped onto the porch, rifle close in hand. Down the slope, 4 riders emerged, dark shapes against the snow. At their head rode a man she recognized instantly, Clay Rourke. Years ago, Clay had stood on her doorstep with a smile too smooth and eyes too sharp, offering to buy her land. He'd spoken of silver veins, hidden wealth, of how a woman alone couldn't possibly hold such ground. She had sent him away, but men like Clay Rourke never accepted refusal as final. Now he had returned, not with an offer, but with guns. Well, now Clay sneered as the riders drew closer. "Look at this. The ghost of Silver Canyon has company. Heard you've been keeping wild dogs up here." His gaze flicked toward Alwyn and Tarek. "Makes a man wonder," he said, smiling thinly, "if you're hiding more than just rays of sunlight." Then his gaze returned to her. "Maybe silver," he sneered. "Maybe something else worth taking." Mara Cole's grip tightened around the rifle. "This is my land. You have no right to be here." Clay Rourke's smile narrowed to something sharp and mean. "A woman alone doesn't get to decide what's hers." And now his eyes flicked toward the cabin. "You've got protection. That just means more mouths to silence when we take what's ours." Before Mara could answer, Alwyn stepped forward, calm, unshaken. His voice was low, but it carried the weight of stone. "Leave. You've no claim here." Clay barked a laugh. "You threatening me?" Alwyn said nothing more. His silence was enough. The first gunshot split the air. The bullet shattered the porch post beside Mara Wood, exploding into splinters. She dropped low as the impact thundered past her. Tarek moved first. An arrow flew fast clean. It struck one rider in the shoulder, knocking him from his horse in a spray of snow. Alwyn surged forward next, a mountain in motion. He hauled another rider from the saddle with brutal precision. Hooves and boots churned the snow as the world fractured into shouting and gunfire. Mara raised her rifle and fired into the air, spooking a horse. It bolted downhill, dragging its screaming rider into the trees. Another man tried to swing wide, but Tarek's second arrow sliced across his arm, sending him staggering. Clay pressed forward, firing wildly, curses cutting through the wind. Alwyn met him head on. The clash was sudden, violent, raw. For a heartbeat, Mara feared Clay might prevail, but Alwyn moved with the steadiness of a man who had survived too many battles to falter now. He struck hard, disarming Clay, but not before Clay's blade tore deep across Alwyn's side. Blood bloomed dark against the snow. Tarek drew his bow again, ready to end it, but Clay stumbled back, clutching his head from Alwyn's blow. He spat into the snow, rage twisting his face. "This isn't over," he shouted. "You hear me, Mara? I'll be back." The threat carried no strength. Clay and the remaining riders fled, dragging their wounded behind them, hooves scrambling down the canyon trail. Silence returned, but not the silence of snow. The silence after violence. Heavy with smoke and blood, Mara dropped to her knees beside Alwyn. His shirt was torn, crimson spreading fast through the fabric. Her hands shook, but she forced them steady as she pressed cloth to the wound. He swayed, breath rough, yet his eyes never left hers. "You should have run," she whispered. His voice came low, almost a growl, softened by truth. "I had something to protect." The words struck her harder than the storm ever had. For years she had told herself no one would fight for her again. No one would stand in harm's way because of her. Yet here he was, bleeding, unyielding, declaring, with a few quiet words, that she mattered. Her hands lingered against his skin as she worked to slow the blood, and in his gaze she saw it, the same truth she had begun to fear within herself. Alwyn was no longer a stranger seeking shelter. He was a man who had chosen to stand and to bleed for her. The snow began to soften beneath the pale touch of the sun. Days of white silence had sealed the canyon, but now dark earth broke through along the ridges. The trails once swallowed whole were opening again. The world, it seemed, was ready to move forward. Mara Cole felt the shift deep in her bones before she allowed herself to name it. The storm had ended. And storms never last forever. No matter how fiercely the heart wishes they might, just to protect what they've sheltered. That morning, Alwyn stood beside the woodpile, his breath lifting in steady white clouds. His broad shoulders bent slightly as he secured his pack. There was a calm to his movements that cut her sharper than a blade. This was not the ease of a man at rest. It was the readiness of a man already leaving. She forced her voice to stay level when she spoke. "You're going." He turned to her. His eyes, dark, steady, held something far from indifference. "We must," he said. "Clay Rourke will return, and next time he'll bring more men. If we stay, we bring danger to your door." The words were plain, but their weight hollowed her chest. Mara wanted to argue, to tell him she had lived with danger her whole life, that this land had already cost her blood. But when she opened her mouth, nothing came. What rose instead was fear, the fear of losing again, what she had only just begun to feel. Alwyn reached into his pouch and drew out the small pendant he had carved by firelight. Bone shaped into a rising sun, its edges smoothed by patient hands. He stepped closer, took Mara's hand, and pressed the pendant into her palm. "This does not mean goodbye," he said softly. "In my people's way, it means home is no longer lost." Her throat tightened. The pendant felt heavier than bone should, as if it carried not only his craft but his heart. "You could stay," she whispered, her voice breaking despite her effort to steady it. "Not forever. Just long enough to see if this means something." For a moment the silence between them burned hotter than fire. Alwyn's gaze held hers steady, unflinching. Then he shook his head slowly. "It already means something," he said. "That's why I must return without fear, so I can stand beside you, not hide in your shadow." Mara swallowed hard. Her lips parted, but no words followed. She understood. To stay now would be to invite danger, to turn hope into recklessness. But to let him go was to tear herself open once more. Tarek mounted his horse without a word. His eyes never met hers. He offered no farewell, only the rigid posture of a man already moving on. Mara barely noticed him. Her world had narrowed to the man standing before her. The pendant clenched tight in her hand. The memory of nights by the fire pressing against her chest like an unhealed wound. Alwyn lifted the reins. One last time his eyes found hers. "If you choose to find us," he said, "follow the river north, where the red rock meets the pines." Then he swung into the saddle. Tall against the pale morning sky, he and Tarek rode down the trail together, their figures shrinking with every breath Mara held. She stood on the porch long after they disappeared. The rising sun carved in bone bit into her palm. The silence around her deepened. Not the silence of choice, but the silence of absence. The cabin no longer felt like a fortress. It felt like an echo. Her heart, once sealed as tightly as the canyon in the winter, now ached with something she had sworn never to feel again. Longing. And as she pressed the pendant to her chest, Mara Cole understood she had been awakened. Not to comfort, not to safety, but to the unbearable truth that she wanted more. The days after Alwyn's departure weighed heavier on her than the storm ever had. The cabin, once her refuge, felt hollow now, its silence no longer a shield, but a wound. Every creak of timber, every whisper of wind through the shutters. The cabin reminded her of the voices that had once filled it, of fire-lit nights where loss had been spoken aloud and shared. Mara told herself she was strong enough to endure it. She had lived alone for years. She could do so again. But strength had changed its shape. Now it felt less like survival and more like an empty place at the table. The pendant lay there, a rising sun carved from bone. She could not pass it without her gaze slowing, without her fingers brushing its edges. She told herself it was only an object, yet in its weight she felt more than bone. A promise, a direction. One morning she stopped resisting. She tied the pendant around her neck, packed a small bundle of dried apples, jerky oats, a flask of water, and saddled Belle. Mara stood for a long moment at the edge of the porch, staring down the trail where Alwyn had vanished days before. This time she did not let the road take from her. This time she chose it. Follow the river north, he had said, where the red rock meets the pines. And so she did. The journey was long, the trail unforgiving. Snow softened into mud. Streams ran high with meltwater. Canyon winds pressed against her like unseen hands. Yet with every mile Mara felt the weight of grief loosening. Each night beneath the stars stripped away another layer of sorrow. Where silence once suffocated her, now it filled her with wonder. The wilderness, vast and unbroken, no longer mirrored her loneliness, but her resilience. She thought of Luke Mercer as she rode, of the life stolen from her, of the years she had spent sealed behind her own walls. For the first time she did not feel guilt for leaving him behind. She felt gratitude for what he had given her, and strength in what she was becoming. Love had not died. It had only changed its form, waiting for the day her heart dared to rise again. At last, after 5 hard days on the trail, she reached the place Alwyn had described. Towering red cliffs climbed into the sky, their faces glowing in the late sun. Pines crowded the ridges, their long shadows stretching across the ground. A thin ribbon of smoke curled above the trees. Her pulse quickened. She dismounted, leading Belle quietly through the pines. Then she saw it, a modest camp tucked between stone and shadow. 2 horses grazed nearby. A fire burned low. Tarek sat with his back turned, shaping an arrowhead with flint. He looked up, startled, his hand freezing mid-motion. For a breath, the world held still. He rose slowly, his expression unreadable, and turned toward the fire. Alwyn followed his gaze. When his eyes met hers, the canyon itself seemed to fall silent. Mara's voice came soft, trembling, but sure. I followed the river. I didn't want to wait. Alwyn crossed the clearing in 3 long strides. For a moment his face gave nothing away. Then it softened into something she had seen only once before, after the bandits, when he had bled in her arms. I hoped you would, he said. Behind him, Tarek shook his head, not in anger, but in quiet disbelief. Then turned back to his carving, leaving the moment to the 2 standing face to face. Mara stepped forward, her hand lifting as if on its own. Alwyn reached for her, and in that touch, all the storms and silence between them fell away. She had walked away from a life built on fear and solitude. Now she stood before a man who had carried her back toward living. And in that moment she understood, home was never just a place. Home was a person. And sometimes, even after loss, the heart dares to begin again. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe love can rise again after loss? Don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe so you won't miss the next story waiting to be told. All stories are created for entertainment purposes and may include fictional elements or dramatized interpretations inspired by historical settings. We use AI tools, voiceover visuals, scripts as creative assistants. However, all content is reviewed, refined, and edited by humans to ensure emotional authenticity and storytelling quality. We fully comply with YouTube's policies regarding AI-generated content and do not use any deepfake techniques or misleading recreations of real individuals. All visuals and supporting materials are properly licensed. Sharing, re-uploading, modifying, or distributing any part of this content in any form requires written permission. We appreciate your support and respect for original creative work